Okay, let's see. Okay, perfect. Okay, Michael, thank you.
Originally from New Jersey in the USA, SueMeades lived in Newfoundland for 17 years, then moved to Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario in 1995. Despite living away for 27 years, Sue is probably the best known botanist in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's the senior author of the annotated checklist of the vascular plants of Newfoundland and Labrador, a document that's been extremely useful to me and to other Newfoundland Labrador botanists over the years. The natural regions of Newfoundland and Labrador has been an indispensable site guide for field biologists also for a long time. Sue is a talented botanical artist, and she has created hundreds of painstakingly accurate illustrations of the native plants of this province. Sue is a photographer. Her images of wild plants form the framework for the Flora of Newfoundland and Labrador, an amazing website that Sue and Bill Meades have been working on for some years now. I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the wildflowers of this province. Sue is a teacher. For 11 years, she taught botany at Algoma University College in Ontario. She also developed the Northern Ontario Plant Database website during that period. Sue is very giving of her time and helps people frequently with plant IDs on the Newfoundland wildflowers site. Sue is a field biologist with 30 years of experience in Newfoundland and remote sites in Labrador. Her work with rare limestone species spurred the establishment of Burnt Cape Ecological Reserve, one of the most important natural sites in this province. Sue has a remarkable knowledge of our native plants. She's a trained taxonomist and is in correspondence with other botanists throughout North America. Anne and I first met Sue in 1990, somewhere around there, when we took a trip together to explore Burnt Cape. And since then, we've had wonderful botanical trips with Sue, Bill, and their children, Debbie and Sean, and we hope there will be many more.
Thank you, wonderful. Now, Sue, got to get her to unmute. Sue, you need to unmute yourself.
Got it.
Got it, okay.
Thanks, Michael, very much. I remember that trip in '95 when we first went over that ridge and saw that bulldozer. Okay, shall I start?
Yes, yes, you can start.
Okay.
I think we're ready. Perfect.
This, yeah, okay, here we go. I changed the title a little bit. It's more about the vegetation of the Churchill River Valley than it is the flora. And that's mainly because most of the flora, with a few exceptions, is not really that rare. And it's very similar to what you see in Newfoundland. Can you all hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
I believe everyone can hear you.
Okay. We'll be talking about different vegetation types and then a few of the species that we find during that. Now, I was up in this region of this Lower Churchill in 2006 with the with Stantec and Agro Environmental, and we were doing the environmental impact statements, the rare plant surveys for the hydro development. So all these photos were taken pre-hydro development. And the reason I decided to show these is that you won't see these pictures and you won't see these sites anymore because most of these images are taken in sites that are now underwater. So you'll be able to see how beautiful the Lower Churchill really was. Okay, now I got to try and minimize these little pictures. Okay, here we go. Okay, here's the area that we surveyed. We started in Happy Valley Goose Bay and went down the Lower Churchill and over to near to Churchill Falls. And we also took a short trip down to Minipee Lake, and that was in 2006. Then in 2010, a crew of us went along the Kenemu River, Mud Lake, and then the Beaver River, looking for a few other rare species. So the first thing you see when you do a survey in this area is Muskrat Falls. Now there's a giant dam across here, but back in 2006, there was no dam. And this is what the the area look like. And this is there's an upper falls and a lower falls. You can see there's not much of a height difference between the two sites. It's just that it's a narrow area, and then the dam was put across here. And in 2006, they had the survey lines put in for the development. From the air, most of our work was done by helicopter. A few sites we did, they took us by a fixed wing into Gull Island and then switched to helicopter to do the western section. So all along the route, you can see the transmission line. This goes right over to Western Labrador. And of the different streams that are tributaries that enter into the Lower Churchill, the first one from Muskrat Falls, this is Muskrat Falls down at the top of the picture there. And the first one is called Lower Brook. And it's a beautiful stream with meandering channels. And the shoreline is mainly alder and willow thickets here. Now, remember that shot I just showed you? This is the same river. This is Lower Brook. And this image here shows you what it looks like now. All that blue is the water. So the blue line that I put here shows you everything that's been flooded. So you don't see any of the river channel. You don't see any of the sand dunes or sandbars that are in the river. This is Upper Brook, which is just upstream of Lower Brook, and it's on the southern channel, or the southern side of Lower Churchill. Has a beautiful deltaic riparian marsh. So it was a great area for birds, I'm sure, but we were just looking at the plants. There's a close-up of the marsh. And looking at the marsh again from a little bit into the tributary. And if you look at the picture from 2006 time and then compare it to the current picture, you can see this blue line again. All of this is flooded, and all of this area in here, all the way down here. So just follow that blue line, you'll see the flood zone. Quite a shame. Is the audio matching with the video, Karen?
Yes, actually, it seems to be quite good, Sue. Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
Yeah.
Great. So along the shorelines, we had a lot of, just shoreline vegetation, the bulrushes. And in Labrador, there's only 2 species of scirpus, where in Newfoundland, there's 7. And a variety of sedges, and then mostly we have speckled alder and different species of willow along the shoreline. This is the red tinged bulrush. And the other one is the black girdled, it's in Labrador. Then the marsh horsetail was very common along the shorelines, especially along the sandbars. And stemless burrweed was quite thick in some areas. And then this is a grass that I hadn't seen on the island before, a short lawn foxtail is quite attractive. And then we saw the bristly crowfoot. Now, those of you who are in the Wildflower Society may remember we found the bristly crowfoot in Newfoundland in the early 1990s at Indian Pond. It was the first time it was reported in many years. So it was fairly uncommon on the island, but in Labrador, it's pretty common in the marshes. And occasionally you get these pools in the sand dune or sandbars, and this one was filled with tadpoles. And if you can see where my cursor is circling, this is a little frog that metamorphosed already from one of these tadpoles. So they're much smaller than the tadpoles look like. It's quite interesting. I'm not a herpetologist, so I don't know what it is.
Yeah, those tadpoles are toads, actually.
That was a toad?
Well, I don't know. He's pretty small, but the tadpoles look very much like toad poles.
One of the people that was with us did know about herpetology. He said that this toad came from these tadpoles.
Yeah, well, it would be a tiny little toad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we found the American toad, and this is the water horsetail. It was quite common. This is in the area right behind Muskrat Falls in the marsh there. And then the smaller tributaries have less water flow, so or less wave action, so you get a more diverse vegetation. So here's your typical tall meadow rue. And common sweetgrass was very common along the smaller tributaries. And inflated sedge was one of our more attractive sedges that we found quite often. And this is our guide. Wherever we go with the consulting firms in the north, you take a guide with you, and they're helpers to you, but they also have a great amount of knowledge about the area. And you'll see the benefit of that a little bit later on in the show. But if we ran into trouble, Peter would always know how to get us out of it. So this is the same iris that we have in Newfoundland, the blue flag iris. So this is our guide, Peter McKay. In some areas, the marshes produces ring around little ponds, and this one is dominated by podgrass. This is the little shore fin. Now, right around the Goose Bay area, where Goose Bay joins the Trans-Labrador Highway, there's a little wet area, and it's just filled with this wild calla lily and marsh cinquefoil down here. That's the one with the compound leaves. You can see some of the white flowers from the calla lily here. The marsh skullwort was found quite commonly in the tributaries along the lower Churchill, but this elephant head lousewort we found in the marshes along the Kenemu River. And that's also called the Greenland lousewort. It's fairly common further north too, but there's only, I think, one place in Newfoundland where it's been found so far. Now the sandbars in the lower Churchill are very common, and they're quite large, and they change all the time. We had one day we went out with a boat, and a skipper, he was telling us that you don't have maps for these areas because the sandbars are changing all the time, so the maps are unreliable. And you'll often get sandbars forming in where there's a slower current of water, so you get in between the islands and the shoreline rather than in the main channels. And you can see from this picture where the color changes. This is underwater. So it's sort of like an iceberg. It's treacherous going through these areas in a small boat because you don't see the sand underneath you. You just see what's up above the water level. And a lot of the shoreline in the lower Churchill has this glaciofluvial clays underlying everything. And this particular shoreline is being cut into by the wave action. And you can see the suspended particles of clay here muddying the water. And here again, you can see it's a bit muddier than the rest of the channel. It's a lot of clay and sand particles suspended in this area. Another picture of the sandbars along the southern shore of lower Churchill. When you get down on the sand dunes, you have some vegetation along the edges, but then back of that you have alder and willow thickets. And in front of the thickets, there's a lot of river beauty growing. That's the name we're using now is listed here, but people may know it as Epilobium latifolium. So here's a close-up of it, and here's another colony of it on the sands. It really loved the sand dunes, or sandbars. There was the native yarrow, Achillea borealis, was quite common on the sandbars, and there's a few examples of it. This one was on a sandbar further upstream, and there was a pollinator on it. Now, this particular sandbar is along the Beaver River, and same vegetation. You have the Achillea, you have the yarrow, and you have the river beauty, and alder and willow thickets. This is all river beauty up here. There's our thickets again. You have Myrica gale, the sweet gale, and then your willows. And they're sort of encroaching on the shoreline. Now, the most common willow that we found was the shining willow. And you can identify this one very easily by the shiny leaves and also these long attenuate leaf apices. So that's very recognizable in the field. Most of them were fairly good sized shrubs, but they could get very tall too. This is an example. This is the Man of War Island in the Churchill. And this is a tree size Salix lucida or a shining willow. And here's some others along the shoreline. Now, the satiny willow was another willow that we had. This one has narrower leaves and the lower surface is very pubescent. And this particular picture shows a group of iridescent beetles eating the leaves of the satiny willow. And they're on this one too. You can just barely make out those dark spots. It's the willow being infested by the beetles. Now, my favorite willow, I like to call it the sand dune willow because it only grows on the sandbars. But the most used common name is heartleaf willow. However, the leaves are really oval. They're not heart-shaped at all. So I like sand dune willow better. As Salix cordata. And here's a picture of, there's some sand dune willow here and over here, and there's a sweet gale in the center of it. Now, underneath the alder and willow thickets, we often found the oracle tway blade. And this one you can tell from the other tway blades because this is the lip here of the flower. And then there's a little flap of tissue that comes up here like the lobe of your ear, but goes backwards. And that curves a bit around the edge of the column, the center portion of the flower. So here the auricle would curve around this portion. This is the column up here. So that's the auricle tway blade. Another common plant underneath the thickets was dwarf enchanter's nightshade. And you can see mixed in with this, there's some horsetails. There's the Equisetum pratense, which is, I think it's called the shady horsetail or the meadow horsetail, and also the woodland horsetail is in here. And then dewberry, Rubus pubescens. Now, the gravel bars are usually more common further upstream than right around the bottom of the lower Churchill. And they had a much more diverse flora too. And here we had, they're really cobbles more than they are gravel. This is Canada wormwood growing in the tall spindly branches, very small flowers on them. And then the alpine campion, which we're all familiar with from the serpentine barrens, but it was very common on these gravel bars throughout the lower Churchill. And one of my favorite plants from up there is this alpine milk vetch, which we had first found at Burn Cape. And I think Claudia found it later on the Port-a-Port. But it's on almost every single gravel bar in the middle part of the lower Churchill. Here's some closer pictures of that alpine milk vetch. And another view of the gravel bars, which again are mainly cobble. You have a lot of river beauty, that's this here growing. And then there's a bottle brush. And regular fireweed was growing there too. This one's an alpine campion, but there is regular fireweed. And the lesser pyrola was the most common pyrola species we found. And this is the one that has a very short stigma. It doesn't extend out beyond the edge of the petals. Northern paintbrush and different moonworts. This one is the matricary moonwort. And this is another picture of the lesser pyrola. And some violets and dewberry down here. We had Viola blanda mostly. Now this huge boulder in the middle of the gravel bar was sheltering a little tiny plant of the northern beach fern. And this is the only time we found that particular fern during the 3 weeks we were up there. Here's a closer picture of it. You can see a river beauty seedling starting here. Now, one of the rare species we were looking for was Canada yew. Now, on the island, it's pretty well evenly distributed across the island, but in Labrador, it was only reported through word of mouth, saying that it was a plant that looked like balsam fir but wasn't, and some of the Aboriginal communities had reported it from around the Gull Island area. So we went there and surveyed, and sure enough, we found some. But unfortunately, it doesn't grow up as tall as it does on the island, because the moose love it. So the moose browse it down all the time. And we found 4 different populations, and not just me, the other crew members. And this is what we call a relic species. It probably survived from the hypsothermal period. That was a warm period in the glacial history. And so the plants had arranged to extend it up into the lower Churchill, but then as the climate cooled, the ones in the lower Churchill survived, but the ones further south disappeared in the higher areas. Now, this is where you'll get to see more or hear more about Peter's expertise. The chopper dropped us off at this location in Cache River. The Cache River is just coming out into the Port Churchill here. So we're just at the mouth of the tributary. And this moose was standing there in the water. And usually all wildlife will run away as soon as they hear a chopper coming, but this moose stayed there. And then the choppers are pretty loud. So once the chopper left and there was no more noise, we could also hear there were wolves howling. So Peter sized everything up and sat there a bit, looked around. And then he noticed across from where we were standing, there was this wolf cub, and there were 2 others hidden in the vegetation back here. And there was another wolf calling, and these little wolves were trying to get around this big rock. So Peter figured out that the mother wolf had probably killed the calf of the moose and was calling for her cubs to come and join in their dinner. So here you can see the wolf cub finally figured out the water wasn't too deep, and he was able to walk along the shore and go in here to meet up with his mother. And here's a little tiny head of one of the other wolves sticking out before he came out of the bush. So once all the cubs went up into the forest to join their mother, the howling stopped, and then the moose decided that there was nothing she could do, and she took off then. So it was a really graphic demonstration of living in the wild, for wild animals. The wildlife people were very jealous when we told them this story, because they hadn't seen a wolf the whole time they were there. Now, going on to the forest, you can see just from this picture, the forests are quite extensive in the lower Churchill. And here's those nice sandbars again. And when you look at fly over them, you see the dominant trees in the forest are mainly white spruce and black spruce, balsam fir, white birch, and trembling aspen. We don't get much larch unless you're in a wetter area. And one of the rare tree species that we found was the mountain maple, and that's quite uncommon in Labrador. That we found more locations than we thought we would. So this one is not that endangered as we once thought. So here's Don Blake, another one of our guides, with the mountain maple. And then this stand is mountain maple and heartleaf birch in the overstory. That's what these are here. Another thing that we found that had only been, it's another relic species that has a range that's mainly southern, but it occurs, we found 4 locations in Labrador for it. This is the mountain wood sorrel, and the leaves look like clover leaves, and you have these beautiful white flowers with pink venation and these 5 yellow dots at the base of the flower. So that's your mountain wood sorrel. Now this is one of the wood ferns that used to be part of the group called Diroptera spinulosa, and that species has been split into 4 different species. So how you tell them apart, I'll show you this slide here. This is the same species, and you can see this is one pinna, which is this, what I'm circling here, one section of the frond. And then you have pinnules on the lower side, and which is called the basoscopic side, and then pinnules on the upper or the acroscopic side. So to identify this species, this particular pinnule is 3 to 4 times longer than this one, and it's closer to the second upper pinnule than it is to the first upper pinnule. So that makes this the mountainwood fern. And one of the forest sites that we surveyed, the understory was just covered in the bristly club moss. That just had a name change recently from Lycopodium to Spinulum. But this is all the Lycopodium in the understory. I've never seen it this dense in Newfoundland. A lot of the areas that have feather moss carpets in the understory, we found the dwarf rattlesnake plantain, a little Goodyear orchid. Here's a close-up of the inflorescence with the beautiful little white flowers. And then the leaves are dark green with these silverish markings on them. And there are 2 other species on the island, but in Labrador, there's only this one species. The one-sided wintergreen was very common in the feather moss carpets, as was the ghost pipe. Here you can see a wasp pollinating this ghost pipe. One of the nicest plants I find around the wetter areas in the forested slopes is the sweet coltsfoot. It would not very closely related to regular coltsfoot. This one has a very different kind of an inflorescence. It's white, and it comes up before the leaves come out, and then it disappears before the leaves spread open. So this is your Petasites, the palmate sweet coltsfoot, not the common coltsfoot. Now, lichen woodlands are very common along the sandy river terraces of the lower Churchill. And the lichen woodlands in this area are what we call adaphic in origin, which means they don't grow that way naturally. They're a result of disturbance, and they develop through secondary succession, where a forest fire has destroyed the forest that's growing over the soil. In this case, the soil is very sandy, so it has a lot of good drainage, and mainly sand, aeolian dunes. We'll get to that in a minute too. So it's what we call an adaphic lichen woodland. Now you can see here, there are little ridges, and we'll talk about them in a minute too. And the vegetation here is fairly stable. You can see a good lichen cover on the ground. And over here, you can see a darker area. This was a more recent burn. And this is what the dunes look like from above. Here's our lower brook again. And there's that pond that you saw a couple of pictures ago. And you see they look like wave action here. This is just the wind blowing the sand over in that direction. And so the dunes they pile up at the edge, all the sand piles up here, and you can see a very obvious end to the dune all around here. And along those edges, you find the slopes are vegetated by poplar and birch. The black spruce can't get a hold of the slopes that much. You get a little bit of white spruce, but mostly black spruce on the lichen woodlands. So here's a typical surface of a lichen woodland, the thick cover of lichen, and then mostly black spruce. And a few of them it's been disturbed a bit. You find the poplar growing on them, and also this is a white spruce in the background. So they're quite beautiful areas. And when you look at the understory, you can see how thick the mat of the lichen is. if it can get 10 to 20 centimeters thick. It's quite dense. And if you walk on it and it's a dry day out, it all crunches and turns into little bits. So your footprints are there forever, pretty much. If it's a moist day, it's very spongy and you don't leave any marks. This is a close-up of the most common reindeer lichen there, the star-tipped reindeer lichen. Now, some of the areas, especially when you get down towards the slopes, you get a lot more vegetation. And some of this is sheep laurel, Kalmia. And then we have the heartleaf birch grows on the dunes, or on the lichen woodlands. And we also found some pin cherry there too. Club mosses are very common. This is a savin leaf ground cedar. And we had the northern ground cedar and the one cone club moss, which is mainly found in Labrador as opposed to Newfoundland, mainly has like a podium clavatum, it has more than one strobilus. You can see there's just one strobilus, which is your spore producing structure on each plant, on each shoot. Now the boreal blueberry is very common on the lichen woodlands. And this is similar to our regular low bush blueberry, but the leaves are narrower. And some people are not sure this is a real species or not. Currently, it's called a separate species, but there's some research going on at Ag Canada now where they don't think it really is. Now, this is the partridge berry, everyone knows that, and that loves to grow in the open sands on those dunes. And northern Camandra, this is a really nice thing to see in the understory. The fruits are orange and yellowish orange. They get to be deep orange when they're ripe, and they're quite common closer to the black spruce. The Kalmia, the sheep laurel, also grows mainly on the areas around the trees. They don't usually grow in the open, except right after a fire. Now, this picture doesn't really show the sheep laurel very well, but I put this one in because down here you see these two clumps of sedges. This is the dark green sedge, Carex tonsa, which was considered rare when we started the survey, but we found it so many times we don't consider it rare in Labrador anymore. Here's a plant of it, and you can see these little structures in here. These are the individual fruiting structures. So inside there, and the keen is the type of fruit, it would be inside the structure called a periginium. And there's a couple of them here. So these are the fruiting parts, and this is the whole plant. Now, when you have wind coming through here, sometimes the sand gets whipped up and the vegetation doesn't get a chance to take a hold. These are called blowouts. And so that sand is moved around. In those areas that we call blowouts, one of the things that colonize them is the woolly heather, the Hudsonia. And they don't look like much at this stage because we got there in July. But if you look closer, we found a few that were in flower, and all these little brown shoots are the flowers that have already died. So we were there 2 weeks earlier. These shrubs would have been covered in yellow flowers. They're just gorgeous. That doesn't grow on the island very much, if at all. I don't think it does grow at all on the island. Now, one of the last sites we visited during this particular survey in 2006, we stopped at this blowout, and you can see the common juniper. And then Don Blake, our guide, asked me what that fuzzy stuff was up here. And we looked at it, and this turned out to be a sedge that had never been reported for Labrador before. This is Houghton sedge, Carex etoniana. And here's the colony of all the sedges, and it's a little bit closer view of the individual plants. And here the individual fruiting structures. These structures are called perigynia, and it's important with identifying sedges, you have to look at these structures and look at the different traits, the bracts that subtend them and the surface. These particular ones have a very hairy surface, so they're easier to identify because of that, because there aren't that many that have hairy perigynia. Now, those lichen woodlands, when they get burnt, this is what they look like. And it doesn't look like there's much vegetation here, but when we get closer, you'll see that there is. Now, this is a good example to show you what the aeolian dunes look like. And as I mentioned before, aeolian just means wind form. So these are dunes on the surface of the sand that were formed by the wind blowing. And the edges of the dunes, they call it an arm or a limb. They get stabilized by vegetation. Vegetation takes hold there. But the wind comes in and whips up the sand here and blows that out. So you don't get as much vegetation in these slight depressions, and it piles the sand up here. Then you get this crest or a ridge formed, and that protects some of the vegetation down here. So then when you have a fire that does come through here, these lines usually persist a little bit better than the vegetation that's in the center. And each of these little dots that you see is actually a young shrub or a young tree starting to emerge. Here's another example. Very steep ridges on the edges, nice recovery there. And a pond, which surprised me because it's on sand, so that should be a very porous underneath, but it's persisting there. Okay, this is a view towards the end of the dune, so you can see the edges there. And just like a step-like pattern going down. Now, when you get down on the surface, there was a lot of bristly sarsaparilla and fireweed. We also had kalmia growing there. Not so much right away, but the fireweed came up very quickly after the fire. Now, this is a site that Bill and I visited in 2017. And you can see the kalmia is definitely the dominant plant in the understory. That's the sheep laurel. That comes up right after fire and establishes itself very quickly. So here's a picture of the dunes in 2015, or one section of the dunes. And here you can see in this lower section, this is 2021. And all of these areas with the sandbars, they've all been inundated with water, including this area here. But the dunes are higher elevation, so the water has only gotten to the edge, but because the water level is there, there's going to be erosion in those areas. So all this is now underwater. This is a Lake Minnipe. I put this picture mainly because to show you the burn on this side. When they brought us in to work further west, they would drop us by a floatplane down here on Lake Minnipe, the edge here. There's a little beach on this side. So, and one of the things that we saw in this area was that there was a lot of glandular birch growing in the burned areas. Now with peatlands, there was a lot of extensive peatlands, but every time you have a river channel that has been cut off, the old oxbows, you'll get a little bit of a fen and marsh vegetation growing in these too. They're quite attractive. And this is a ribbed fen. You can tell that's named that mainly because these little lines of vegetation look like ribs. And fens are dominated by sedges, and they're more nutrient rich than bogs are, and they're usually more shallow vegetation too. Now this particular ribbed fen has developed in a slump, and what a slump is, you can see this border here. Can everyone see that? Looks like a ridge. That's actually a cliff because this area slumped out. And I don't know if you remember that picture I showed with the clay banks along the river. When the clay gets saturated, you have a heavy rain or a lot of snow melting, the clay will start to liquefy a bit and get slippery, and the vegetation growing on it will slip off the surface and go into the river. So this is a large slump. They call them slump areas. And then the peatlands develop in these slump areas. And this track here, this line, that's the snowmobile trail. Here's another view of that ribbed fen growing in this slump. And this is on the other side of the river, on the southern shore. And this was a more recent slump. You can see the edge where it fell. And there's the The peatlands haven't developed as much. There's still an awful lot of open water here. Now, as I mentioned, fens are dominated by sedges, and forb is just a flowering plant that's not a grass. So you have a lot of sedges back here, and forbs excludes sedges too. And there's Peter helping with the collecting. And one of the common shrubs that we found in the fen was your mountain fly honeysuckle. So that's the fruit here, the blue fruit of mountain fly honeysuckle, of very pubescent leaves. It's quite a beautiful area. And the bottle brush is in here. That's another indicator of fens, as is the lonicera, the honeysuckle. This is a string bog and ribbed fen complex. So this upper area is mainly fen, and as you get further down, you're starting to get this turn into bog. So as the vegetation builds up, you'll get more sphagnum developing, and then that becomes a bog once it has a base of sphagnum peat. It's another section of it. This is still fen, but you get bog on these lower areas. This is a slope bog, and here's the Trans-Labrador Highway, and that white feathery stuff is just sand that's been kicked up by a car that just drove by there. And this particular bog is, as are all bogs, they're dominated by sphagnum moss and low shrubs. And this picture, you can see all the shrubs form a hummocky surface, as opposed to the common, the even grassy surface of the fens. And in the higher areas, you'll get lichens growing on the hummocks. That's what these white patches are, all the lichens. You get fen back here. So the surface of the bog, you'll often find stunted larch and black spruce. And then here's an esker going across a string bog. An esker is a deposit of sand and gravel from the meltwater channel of an old glacier. So if you can just imagine a glacier on top of this, this had been where the water was coming through, and then the rocks would fall out and be deposited in these windy shapes. Now in the bogs, you had fen pools that start to fill in as the sphagnum gets deeper. And these are often dominated by horned bladderwort or some of the other bladderworts. This is Utricularia cornuta, the horned bladderwort. It's a close-up pictures of it. That's Dawn again. Now, in the lower Churchill, most of the area has fairly thin or shallow bogs, but here over on the Kennewa River, there was this one area that was just filled with dome bogs, which are very deep bogs, and they have a center that's higher than the surrounding areas. Although these are very complex, several of the bogs have more or less coalesced into a huge complex. So this is what the pools look like from just above the surface. And then when you get on the surface, you can see the yellow pond lily or the bullhead lily that's growing in the ponds. In fens, you don't have the water deep enough to support that, but you do that, you get this in the bogs. Now, tributaries along the lower Churchill. Here's your lower brook. It's a beautiful meandering channel. This particular one looked like a swan, I thought. And here you can see this is along Upper Brook. The water coming in from the tributary is very dark, and that's dissolved organic matter. And as it meets the lower Churchill, it intermixes, and you can see the colors change as it goes downriver. And here's an area where there's a lot of sand dunes collected right there. You can see some slumping along the edges of the river here. And so there's a lot of sand going into this and clay going into this river above this area. And this is a picture of that same bay, but from a closer view. So all these dunes or all these sandbars, there's no way you can get a boat in on here. This is the delta of the Pinus River. This is all underwater now too. Beautiful delta. Now this particular river doesn't have a name on the maps, but you can see the channel is very brown, and that's from dissolved organic matter. And then you have these other channels right next to it that are blue, and these are ones that are old oxbows that have been cut off. They're not connected to the main river channel anymore, so there's no sediment going through them. Here's a beautiful example of the sediment coming into from a tributary into the lower Churchill. And as it goes downstream, it just spreads out more. Now, you've probably all heard of Gull Island. This is, well, Gull Lake is this whole area. It's really just a wider part of lower Churchill. So this particular Gull Island, and there's a lot of smaller sandbars surrounding it. And here you can see on this view, all the sandbars down here. This is Gull Lake. So this is Gull Island and all these sandbars down here. And then there's a few back here. Now this particular island here is this one down here in the lower corner. And then when you look at this picture at the bottom, you can see that there are no more sand dunes. There are no more sandbars showing. They're all underwater now too. And this river channel has gone in. This was the Pinus River. It's all underwater now too. Well, I'm just going to go back one picture if I can. No, I can't. Maybe I can. No, I don't know how to go backwards. Anyway, we went past the picture of Horseshoe Rapids, which is just past Gull Lake and Gull Island. Now these next few pictures are going towards Churchill Falls. They're just examples of the beauty of that river. Higher up you get, or the further west you get. Now, if you look where my pointer is, you can see a white line going across here. That's a transmission line going from Twin Falls over to Muskrat Falls. Not Muskrat, Twin Falls to Churchill Falls. And when we were flying over there, I saw this large area that was like a boulder field. And we had stopped down there, and there were quite large sized cobbles growing there. And I asked my friend Andy Fionn, who's a geologist in Ontario, if he could explain what was going on here. And he looked at the pictures for me and showed me these points that there was the river terrace, the original river terrace from the early glacial period. And then there's another terrace that's hard to pick out from this image, but you'll see it again in the next shot. That was an older river terrace. And then the current river terrace is down at this level. And there was a valley to the right of my cursor, and the water would come down this direction. But right now there's just a tiny little creek going through there. But during when the glaciers were melting, there would have been a lot of water coming through here, and they would have brought all these large cobbles down with it. And you can see this is the middle river terrace. And there were these, you know, when we saw them coming in by chopper, they look like hills that someone made. They're natural from the river, the old river terrace, and they've been cut into by the water that's coming down through that valley. When you get down on the surface, you can see large cobbles, and they look kind of fuzzy here because they're covered in lichens now. Oh, and this is the river valley. The water would have come down through here. And this is the eroding face of one of the river terraces. And here's a transmission line going from Twin Falls over to Churchill Falls. And then we turned around and went back. So I've got one more picture to show you. This is Mud Lake. We went to Mud Lake one day looking for whatever we could find there. And we came across this interesting old truck with an alder growing in the bed of the truck. They used to have a road there when there was a logging operation going on, but there's no more roads and no more vehicles in Mud Lake community. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Sue. That's great. What is that growing in the truck? Do you know?
Yeah, it's an alder. It's just an alder.
An alder and
Yeah.
some moss.
Yeah, yeah.
That's wonderful. I think we certainly have time for some questions if you're willing to take some
Sure.
questions. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have a question?
What happens? It's Ann Mills here in Nova Scotia, Karen. I just
Yes.
wondered where, or at least Susan, I just wondered what all this, I mean, there's all this wonderful, lovely vegetation, trees, shrubs, and so on. So what happens to it all? I guess it just stays underwater for the rest of its life because of the power grid.
Yeah, well, it's not going to survive. It's going to drown. You know, it's going to be killed by the water levels. We're hoping that the river estuaries are reestablished, but it's going to take a long while, and you don't have those nice sloping approaches to the rivers anymore once the water level is high. So it's going to be a long time before they get any estuaries back, or not estuaries, deltas back. There was a plan in the beginning when they were planning the Lower Churchill to cut all the trees so that they wouldn't end up as rotting in the water. But then they decided not to because it was too expensive. So this is something that is a decision of politicians, not the botanists. The Lower Churchill is fairly new. You know, we don't know what's happened up at the Upper Churchill. We don't know what the shores of Smallwood Reservoir look like. You can only imagine, right? Everything is drowned. That's about it.
Huh. It's really interesting.
Hmm.
I suppose there are other power lines that have gone. I should know this. I mean, I'm interested in it, but I just haven't. It's just off my radar for the moment. If they'd followed the evolution of other flooded areas and if they've come back, or if they're spread out, or presumably the geology underneath that water and everything will be changed forever.
Well, the geology won't be changed, at least the lower part, but definitely you're going to get a lot more sedimentation as the sides of the sand terraces erode. You're going to get, I don't know what they're going to do with all the sand that's coming down and hitting the dam. How do they have a way to dredge that out? I don't know. There's an awful lot of sand bars below the Lower Churchill, below Muskrat Falls Dam. But there's a lot of sand coming down the Lower Churchill right to the dam. So they have to have a way to get rid of that. Otherwise, they're going to clog their intake. But that's, that's for the engineers to figure out. We just tell them what plants are growing around.
Yeah, well, it'll be an interesting thing to watch in the future. Should we all live so long to figure it out?
Yeah, well, you can imagine there's going to be some problems, but whether or not anyone is monitoring it is another question.
Yes, thank you. That's wonderful.
Sue,
Sue,
oh, sorry, please go ahead.
Sue, it's Andy here.
Hi,
really,
Andy.
lovely presentation. I'm really curious about the Alpine Campion. And of course, the only
Yeah.
place I've seen it has been on the tablelands.
Right. Yeah.
What is unusual about the gravel bars? What's special about that habitat that appeals to the Campion?
No idea, and there are a lot of calciphiles growing there, like the alpine milk veg too. There's got to be some calcium deposits further north. Was that part of an inland sea? I'm not sure. because you would have had to have had limestone coming down in order to support that alpine milk vetch too. So we don't take soil samples when we're doing the botany, but I'm sure there were some geologic reports that you might be able to access. But definitely the gravel bars were really amazing, the diversity on them.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask if when you were doing your survey of what the plants were, did that affect at all how things were developed afterwards? I mean, were there any plants that needed protection or any changes made to what happened?
Well, from our perspective, yes, but from the government's perspective, probably not. Because when you look at those flood lines, the populations of wood sorrel that we identified, they're now underwater, and the populations of taxus are now underwater. So unless there are other populations that no one has located yet, those things are lost to our flora. We're hoping that personally me, I'm hoping that the Gull Island dam never gets developed, because that'll just take away any other chances of taxus or oxalis being discovered in that area, the western half of the lower Churchill.
So the picture with all the club mosses, there's
Yeah.
so many of them.
Yeah.
Was there anything in that habitat that made them grow so many of them in the one spot?
Well, I think they just like not having that much competition. You know, I'm not really sure much about the ecology of club mosses, but they like open areas, most of the species, and they are you thinking of the one in the woods or on the lichen woodland?
The one that was a ton of them, just the
Oh yeah,
most I've ever seen
in the
together.
forest, yeah.
Yeah.
That, I don't know, it may be a nice rich slope there. No, it was a slope coming down towards the river. But they definitely like that area. I don't know why. I've never seen that in Newfoundland, just in Labrador.
So your images are stunning. They're absolutely stunning, and not even for a person interested in botany, but on the radio we hear so much about Muskrat Falls, Twin Falls, Churchill Falls. We don't visualize what it is, and it wasn't until I looked at your pictures to see what's happened up there. I can see how Indigenous people really take it so personal because they're there and they've seen the way it was and the beauty of it. It's absolutely stunning. But it's nice to see what's happening up there too, because I never visualized what it all looked like. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we have a few comments, but the comments are very favorable. People are saying, thank you, Susan, for sharing the spectacular beauty of Labrador. Very interesting and stunning pictures. It's also sad to think of the loss.
Yeah.
And then Kay says, really appreciate and enjoy the geology of the presentation. Thanks for your observations and knowledge sharing, Sue. You make it such a pleasure. And I think Kathy Field says thank you, but we have Heather McDonald, who's from Canadian Forestry Service tonight, and she says a visually delightful presentation. So I think everybody would agree. It's been wonderful to see the I keep thinking 50 Shades of Green myself because it's so green, so beautiful and green up there. But the flowers, your photos of the flowers were perfect as well. Yeah.
You know, it's the kind of area where you just wish you could stay there for months and months and just explore, because every single spot was unique in one way or another. So very interesting.
Yes.
Well, so you take a great picture on a moving plane, I have to say.
Well, you only see the best of them. You don't see the ones that I have to throw out.
Oh, they're fabulous.
Okay, well, I guess if we have no more questions, I'm going to stop the video because I'm doing that video and the recording. And we'll say goodnight to everybody.
Thanks for your
and-
help, Andy, too.
Thanks, Sue.
Yes, yeah, hope to see
Night.
you in the
Thanks.
fall.
Great.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
It's
Great program.
fabulous.
Have a good summer.
Thanks very much, Michael and Ann, too.
We look forward